Hello, and welcome to English on this day. I hope you are doing well. Today, you and I are going to learn about the life of one remarkable man in United States history. A man who was not born powerful. A man who did not have a great army behind him. A man who did not have great wealth or a famous family. He had no army. He had no crown. He had no great fortune. He had only words. His name was Thomas Paine. But sometimes, words can be stronger than weapons. Paine knew how to use simple words to speak to ordinary people. When many people were afraid of the future, he wrote about freedom, courage, and independence. His words moved from person to person. People read them, people talked about them, and slowly, words became courage. Courage became action, and action helped shape a new nation. Thomas Paine became one of the important voices of his time. But his story is not only about politics or history. It is also about an ordinary man who believed that one person could make a difference. So, stay with me. Today, you and I will discover his journey, his struggles, his words, and the powerful legacy he left behind. Let's begin the story of Thomas Paine, the man who had no army, but had the power of words. Chapter 1. The Boy from Thetford. Thomas Paine was born on February 9th, 1737, in Thetford, a small and quiet town in Norfolk, England. It was not a famous place. Most people had never heard of it, and there was nothing particularly special about it. It was simply a small town where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. His father was a corset maker. A corset is a piece of clothing. He made them by hand. It was slow, careful work. It did not make anyone rich. The family was not wealthy, and they were not part of any powerful or important social class. They were working people, doing what they needed to do to get by. Thomas grew up in a world that was perfectly normal. There were no great moments in his early childhood that suggested he would one day become one of the most widely read writers of his era. He was simply a boy growing up in a small English town, surrounded by ordinary life. There was no clear sign that this boy would one day change things. No money, no famous name, no powerful connections. History is full of stories about great people who began in great places. Thomas Paine is a reminder that great lives do not always have great beginnings. Sometimes they begin exactly here, in a small house in a town that most people never visit. Thomas did go to school when he was young. He received a basic education, learning to read and write. But he left school at a relatively young age, as many boys from working families did at that time. There was work to be done, and education was a luxury that had limits. Even without a long or prestigious education, something in Thomas kept asking questions. He was curious about the world. He watched how people lived, how society worked, and why things were the way they were. He learned not from books alone, but from the people around him and the experiences he had every day. Education does not always begin in a classroom. Sometimes life becomes the classroom. His first experience of work came alongside his father. He learned the corset trade, sitting with tools in hand, doing the kind of careful work that required patience, but offered very little excitement. He would later try other kinds of work too, searching for something that felt right. But none of it settled easily. What this early working life gave him, though, was something important. He understood what it felt like to be an ordinary person. He knew what it meant to work hard and still struggle. He knew the concerns and frustrations of everyday people. That understanding, built quietly over years, would later become one of his greatest strengths as a writer. Thomas Paine did not begin with power. He began with a simple life in a small town, and that simple life shaped everything that came after. A young man with no famous name was slowly learning from an ordinary life, and that ordinary life would one day become the foundation of extraordinary words. Chapter 2. A Life Full of Changes. Thomas Paine was not a man who found his place easily. He tried many different kinds of work during his earlier years. He worked as a corset maker like his father. He tried other trades. He became an excise officer, a government worker responsible for collecting taxes on goods. None of these paths gave him a simple or comfortable life. Working as an excise officer was particularly difficult. The pay was low, and the work itself involved constant pressure. Paine actually tried to campaign for better conditions and higher wages for excise workers, writing a pamphlet about it. That effort went nowhere at the time, but it showed something important about him. He noticed injustice, and he felt compelled to say something. His personal life also carried disappointments. He had difficulties with money throughout these years. Things did not come together easily or neatly. There were periods when the future felt unclear, and the present felt unstable. He was not living a smooth or successful story by most ordinary measures. But Paine did not stop. He kept looking for another path. Some people face failure and decide they are done. Paine was different. He kept moving, kept trying, kept looking for something that matched what was inside him. Sometimes a closed door makes us look for another door. That is exactly what Paine did, again and again. In 1774, something happened that would change everything. Paine was in London, and he met Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was already a famous figure. He was a scientist, a writer, a diplomat, and one of the most respected Americans of his time. The two men spoke, and Franklin recognized something in Paine. He saw a sharp mind, a talent for language, and a genuine desire to engage with the important questions of the day. Franklin encouraged Paine to consider going to America. He gave Paine a letter of introduction that would open doors in Philadelphia. It was a simple act of kindness and recognition from one man to another, but it would prove to be one of the most consequential conversations of the 18th century. Paine made the decision to go. He left England behind, left the familiar streets and the limited possibilities, and stepped onto a ship headed across the Atlantic. It was a frightening and uncertain choice. He was going somewhere he had never been, to start over in a world he did not yet know. Sometimes, changing your life begins with one decision. Paine was not born brave. He became brave by making difficult choices, one at a time, until he found himself standing on the edge of a new world, ready to begin again. He did not know who he would become in America, but he was about to find out. Chapter 3. Arriving in America. Thomas Paine arrived in Philadelphia in 1774. He was a stranger in every sense of the word. He had no reputation in this city, no existing connections beyond the letter from Franklin, and no clear plan for what exactly came next. He had to start again, just as he had done before. Philadelphia was a city unlike any place Paine had known in England. It had a busy port, active markets, craftsmen and traders moving through its streets, and political conversations happening everywhere. It was alive with energy. and beneath that energy was a tension that Paine could feel from his first days there. America was changing, and the question of its relationship with Britain was becoming impossible to ignore. Paine found work writing for a publication called the Pennsylvania Magazine. It gave him a platform and a purpose. He wrote about topics that mattered to people: social issues, injustice, everyday concerns. He was not simply writing to earn money. Something was happening inside him as he wrote. He was finding his voice, the kind that could reach ordinary people rather than just scholars and politicians. His writing style was different from what most readers were used to. He used simple words. He wrote clear sentences. He asked questions directly and answered them directly. He did not try to impress people with complicated language. He tried to be understood, which is a very different goal. That approach would become his most powerful tool. Then, on April 19th, 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord took place. American militiamen and British soldiers exchanged gunfire in Massachusetts. The conflict that had been simmering for years had become a real war. Paine was no longer just an observer writing about politics. He was living inside a historical moment that was taking shape in real time. He came to America looking for a new life. Soon, America would give his life a new purpose. The newcomer from Thetford, the excise officer who had spent years searching for his place, was about to discover exactly what he was here to do. A newcomer was slowly finding his place in a country that was searching for its own future, and those two searches, his and America's, were about to become deeply connected. Paine had not yet written the words that would make him famous, but he was preparing, whether he fully knew it or not. He was reading, watching, listening, and writing every day. He was building something without yet knowing the full shape of what he was building. That is often how great things begin, not with a clear plan, but with a committed practice. The city around him was loud with debate and heavy with tension. And in that environment, Paine was beginning to understand that he had something to offer that no army and no politician could provide in quite the same way. He had words that ordinary people could actually use. Chapter 4. Common Sense. By late 1775, America stood at a turning point. The war with Britain had begun, but a deep and serious question remained unanswered. Should the colonies fight simply to restore their rights within the British system? Or should they break away completely and build something new? Many people were not certain, many were afraid, and many had simply never heard the argument for independence made in a way they could truly understand. Paine saw this clearly. He understood that the debate was not reaching the people who needed to be part of it. Long political speeches and legal documents were written for educated elites. Ordinary farmers, tradespeople, and workers were not engaged by that language. Someone needed to speak directly to them, in words they could follow and ideas they could hold. So Paine began writing. He did not write a formal political treatise. He wrote a pamphlet, something short, direct, and designed to be read aloud. He used plain language, clear logic, and direct questions. He challenged the basic idea that a king had any natural right to rule over people. He asked why a large continent should remain tied to a small island across the ocean. He made the case for independence in terms that did not require a university education to understand. Common Sense was published on January 10, 1776. It spread with remarkable speed. People read it in taverns, in homes, on street corners. Those who could not read had it read to them. Copies passed from hand to hand across the colonies. Within months, it had sold an enormous number of copies, making it one of the most widely distributed written works in the history of the American colonies. Imagine being an ordinary person picking up that pamphlet. You are not a politician. You are not a philosopher. You are a farmer or a shopkeeper or a carpenter. And for perhaps the first time, you are reading about the biggest question facing your world in language that feels like it was written for you. That was exactly what Paine intended, and that is exactly what he achieved. Paine did not create the independence movement by himself. Many people, many events, and many arguments had been building for years. But common sense helped take those arguments and put them in the hands of the people who would ultimately decide what happened. It made independence feel possible and reasonable to people who had never fully considered it before. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Paine had not written it, but common sense had helped build the intellectual environment in which such a declaration could be made and supported. A small pamphlet had found a very large audience. Paine had discovered something that would define the rest of his writing life. His pen could reach people he might never meet, in places he might never visit, at moments he could not predict. Writing done honestly and clearly is one of the most powerful forces a single person can put into the world. And Paine was only getting started. The most challenging and dramatic moments of his writing life were still ahead. America had declared independence, but the work of actually winning it was far from done. The next chapter of Paine's story would take place not in a comfortable study or a busy city street, but in the darkest and most difficult period of the Revolutionary War. He had shown the world what his pen could do. Now the world would show him what a writer must do when the people around him are losing hope. Chapter 5. The Crisis. Words in a Dark Time. Independence had been declared, but declaring something and achieving it are two very different things. By the end of 1776, the Continental Army was in serious trouble. British forces had pushed Washington's troops out of New York. The army was exhausted, underfed, and shrinking as enlistments expired and men went home. The dream of independence was beginning to look like it might not survive the winter. This was the moment when many people began to doubt. The early excitement of the revolution had met the harsh reality of war, and reality was winning. Soldiers were suffering. Morale was collapsing. And at home, ordinary people were watching and wondering whether any of this had been worth it. Paine was with the Continental Army during this time. He was not simply observing from a safe distance. He was there, in the cold, among people who were exhausted and frightened. And in December 1776, he wrote. He wrote not as a comfortable intellectual sharing opinions from a desk, but as a man who had seen the struggle up close and still believed the cause was worth continuing. The first American crisis paper opened with one of the most famous sentences in the English language. These are the times that try men's souls. That sentence is simple. Every word in it is easy to understand, and yet it carries something real and heavy. It says, "This moment is hard. This moment is testing people in the deepest way. That is the truth, and Paine was not going to pretend otherwise." What followed in that piece was not a list of political arguments. It was something more immediate. It was an honest conversation with people who were struggling, written by someone who was struggling alongside them. Paine reminded them why the fight mattered, and why giving up now would mean throwing away everything they had already sacrificed. General Washington had the writing read aloud to his soldiers before the crossing of the Delaware River. Those men, cold and tired on Christmas night, listened to Paine's words. We cannot know exactly what effect any single piece of writing has on any single person, but Washington valued what Paine offered, and the army that crossed the river that night went on to win an important victory at Trenton. Paine understood something essential about words. They cannot always change the situation, but they can change how people face the situation. A writer may not hold a weapon, but a writer can help people find courage when courage is exactly what they need and can barely find in themselves. When Paine could not change the battlefield, he tried to change the spirit of the people. And in that cold and desperate December, his words did something that no military order could easily accomplish. They reminded people that they were still in this together, and that together it was still possible to keep going. The crisis papers continued to be published throughout the war, 16 of them in total, each one appearing at moments when the revolution needed steady, clear words more than almost anything else. Paine did not write them from a position of safety or certainty. He wrote them from the middle of the struggle, as someone who had chosen a side and was willing to keep showing up for it. That kind of writing, honest and committed and built from real experience, has a quality that purely theoretical writing rarely achieves. People can feel the difference. Chapter 6. Paine After the Revolution. In 1783, the Revolutionary War came to an end. The Treaty of Paris was signed, and Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. It was a moment of enormous historical significance. The country that Thomas Paine had helped inspire toward independence now existed as a real and recognized nation. But for Paine himself, the ending of the war did not bring the kind of reward that people might expect. He did not become wealthy. He did not take on a prominent government position. He did not settle into the comfortable life of a celebrated national hero. The success he had helped create was not the kind of success that filled his own pockets or placed him at the center of power. This is a very human part of Paine's story. He had contributed something genuine and important to the revolution, but that contribution did not translate neatly into personal comfort or recognition. He continued living and working, caring more about ideas than about accumulating the material rewards that others might have pursued in his position. He traveled. He moved between America and Europe, visiting England, meeting thinkers and politicians, observing how different societies were developing. He was always watching, always thinking, always noticing what ordinary people were experiencing and what systems of government were or were not serving them well. By the late 1780s, Paine was back in England. And Europe itself was changing dramatically. France was approaching revolution. The old structures of power and privilege that had governed European societies for centuries were being challenged in ways that had not been seen before. Paine watched all of this with deep interest. The American Revolution had ended, but Paine's journey was far from over. For him, finishing one chapter never meant stopping. It meant looking for the next one, the next place where his thinking and his writing might be useful. He was a man driven not by comfort or ambition, but by a persistent need to engage with the biggest questions of his time. Europe was full of those questions, and Paine was heading back into the middle of them. He had no particular reason to believe the next chapter would be easier than the ones before. History had not been especially gentle with him. But Paine had a quality that difficulty could not easily remove. He remained engaged with the world around him and committed to the belief that writing about it honestly was still worth doing. That combination, engagement and commitment, is what separates people who change the world from people who simply watch it change. Paine had always been in the first group. He still was, and what came next would test that commitment in ways he had not yet experienced. Chapter 7. Rights of Man. In 1789, revolution came to France. The French people rose up against the old system of monarchy and aristocracy that had governed them for centuries. The Bastille was stormed. The old order began to collapse. Europe watched with a mixture of excitement and fear as one of its most powerful kingdoms went through radical transformation. Paine followed these events with great interest. He had been in France and maintained connections there. He saw in the French Revolution many of the same ideals he had fought for in America: the right of people to choose their own government, the challenge to inherited power, the demand that ordinary people be treated with dignity and given a voice in their own lives. When an English politician named Edmund Burke wrote a strongly critical response to the French Revolution, arguing that the old order deserved protection and that radical change was dangerous, Paine felt compelled to respond. The result was Rights of Man, the first part published in 1791 and the second part in 1792. The central idea of Rights of Man is not complicated to understand, even if the political implications of it were enormous. People, Paine argued, have basic rights simply because they are human. These rights do not come from kings or governments. They exist before governments, and governments are only legitimate when they protect those rights rather than violating them. When a government fails to serve the people have the right to change it. Paine knew that writing this way about governments and power was not a safe choice. He was challenging the established order of European society, not just in theory but in direct and readable language that anyone could pick up and engage with. That kind of writing attracted attention from people in power who did not appreciate what he was saying. He wrote anyway. He had never chosen safety over honesty when the stakes were high, and he was not about to start now. That consistency is one of the most defining qualities of his entire life. He believed what he wrote, and he wrote what he believed, regardless of the personal consequences. In 1792, something unexpected happened. Paine was elected to the French National Convention. The man who had been a corset maker's son in a small English town, who had struggled through years of difficult work and disappointment, was now a member of a governing body at the center of one of Europe's most dramatic political transformations. It was a remarkable turn. But entering that political world made things more complicated, not less. The French Revolution was not a clean or simple process. Political factions competed fiercely. The atmosphere was dangerous. And Paine, a foreigner who did not speak French fluently, was navigating it all while continuing to hold to his own principles in a situation that frequently punished people for doing exactly that. The man who once had only a pen was now standing inside one of Europe's great political changes, and the next development in his story would be one of the most difficult of his life. Paine's words had taken him much farther than he had probably expected when he first sat down to write about rights and governments. He had crossed oceans, entered political debates at the highest levels, and made himself known in multiple countries through the force of his ideas and the clarity of his writing. But fame and influence do not protect a person from danger, and the danger that was coming for Paine was very real, very close, and very personal. Chapter 8: Prison and the Power of Hope. In December 1793, Thomas Paine was arrested. He was taken from his home in Paris and placed in the Luxembourg prison. The charge was connected to his status as a foreigner and to the shifting political winds of the French Revolution, which had turned violent and unpredictable in ways that made anyone a potential target. Consider what that moment meant. Here was a man who had spent his adult life writing and speaking about freedom, about the rights of human beings, about the injustice of arbitrary power. And now that same man was sitting behind prison walls, with no clear idea of when or whether he would be released. The irony was stark and painful. Paine was not alone in facing imprisonment during the Reign of Terror, as this brutal period of the French Revolution became known. Many people were arrested on flimsy grounds, and many were executed. Paine himself came close to execution on at least one occasion. He survived, though the details involve a combination of circumstance and good fortune. He spent about 10 months in prison. His health suffered. The conditions were harsh and the uncertainty was constant. But even in prison, Paine continued to think and to write. He had begun working on a text called The Age of Reason before his arrest, and he continued developing it during his imprisonment. The Age of Reason was a work about religion and independent thinking. Paine believed that people should use reason and evidence rather than blindly accepting what authority told them. The book was controversial and would later damage his reputation in America, where many readers found his views on religion difficult to accept. But the fact that he continued writing it while in prison reveals something essential about him. His circumstances could not silence his mind. In November 1794, Paine was finally released. James Monroe, the American minister to France, had worked to secure his freedom. Paine emerged from prison in poor health, but still himself, still thinking, still with things to say. He returned to his writing, continued working on The Age of Reason, and tried to recover both physically and emotionally. A prison could hold his body, but it could not easily hold his ideas. That is one of the most powerful things about Paine. His thinking was never fully contained by his circumstances, no matter how difficult those circumstances became. One of the most powerful moments in Paine's life came when he had very little freedom but still had his mind and his words. That combination, curiosity plus the determination to keep using it regardless of the situation, is perhaps the most defining quality of his entire character. He had been tested in every way a person can be tested, by failure, by poverty, by political danger, and now by imprisonment. He had not emerged from any of those tests unchanged, but he had emerged from all of them still writing, still thinking, and still believing that his words had something worth offering. That stubbornness, if it can be called that, is not a small quality. It is one of the rarest and most valuable things a human being can have. Chapter 9. A New Dream for Society. After his release from prison, Paine continued living in France for several more years. His health had been damaged and his circumstances were not easy, but his mind remained active and his concern for the lives of ordinary people had not diminished at all. If anything, the experiences of the revolution had deepened his awareness of how much ordinary people stood to gain or lose, depending on how societies organized themselves. In 1797, he published a work called Agrarian Justice. It was shorter and less widely known than his famous earlier pamphlets, but it contained ideas that were genuinely ahead of their time. Paine argued that society owed something to its members, that the concentration of land and wealth in the hands of a few was not a natural condition, but a human arrangement that had created poverty for many. He proposed a specific scheme in which landowners would pay a ground rent that would be used to provide a basic payment to every person when they came of age and again in old age. The ideas in agrarian justice reach forward in time in a remarkable way. Questions about wealth distribution, about what society owes its members, and about how to address poverty through organized systems are still very much alive today. Paine was thinking about these things more than 200 years ago, from personal experience and from observation of the world around him. From the beginning, Paine had known what it was like to struggle. He had been the son of a working man, had held insecure jobs, had experienced poverty firsthand. That background was not just a detail of his biography. It was the emotional core of his thinking. When he wrote about the concerns of ordinary people, he was not writing from the outside looking in. He was writing from memory. He also never stopped looking forward. His life had been marked by setbacks, but he consistently refused to be defined by them. Each piece of writing, each new idea, each new question was a way of insisting that tomorrow could be different from today, that the problems visible in the present did not have to be permanent features of the future. He kept asking the same essential questions throughout his life, in different forms and in different contexts. Can society be better than this? Can ordinary people have more voice, more security, more dignity? What does it take to move closer to a world that is actually fair? Paine's life was built around one habit. Never stop asking whether tomorrow could be better than today. His ideas changed and developed, but his concern for ordinary people remained constant across everything he wrote and everything he did. And now, after years in Europe marked by revolution, imprisonment, and continued writing, Paine was preparing to make one final journey. He was going back to the country where his most famous work had been done, the country he had helped in his own way to bring into existence. He was going back to America. Chapter 10. Returning to America. In 1802, Thomas Paine made the long journey back across the Atlantic to America. He had been gone for many years. The world he was returning to was not the same world he had left. President Thomas Jefferson, who remained a supporter of Paine even when others had turned away from him, helped facilitate his return. Arriving back in America was a moment full of complicated feeling. Paine had first come to this country as an unknown immigrant with a letter of introduction in his pocket. He was returning now as a man who had played a real role in the revolution that created the country he was stepping back into. The colonies he had known were now a republic with a constitution, an elected government, and a growing population spreading across an expanding nation. But the reception was not entirely warm. The publication of The Age of Reason had cost Paine significant public support in America. Many Americans were deeply religious, and his views on religion had offended and alienated people who had once admired him. The man who had once been celebrated for common sense was now viewed by many with suspicion or outright hostility. He had helped write about a new America, and now he was living in the country that had grown from that struggle. But he was doing so as a somewhat marginal figure, no longer at the center of events, not celebrated as a hero might expect to be. It was a quiet and sometimes lonely kind of return. He was also older and in poor health. The years in Europe, including the months in prison, had taken a toll on his body. He was not the energetic writer who had crossed the Atlantic in 1774, full of possibility and ambition. He was a tired and aging man who still had opinions, still wrote when he could, and still cared deeply about the questions that had occupied him all his life. He spent his remaining years in America largely out of the spotlight. He wrote occasional pieces, continued to think about society and politics, and lived quietly. He was not the triumphant hero returning to grateful crowds. He was simply a man growing older, finding his way through the final years of a long and remarkable life. Coming home was not simply a return. It was a chance to see how much the world had changed, how much he himself had changed, and to sit quietly inside the country that his words had once helped move in a particular direction. He was not celebrated the way he might have hoped, but he was there. He had made it back. And for a man who had spent so much of his life starting over in unfamiliar places, simply being present in a world that his words had touched was perhaps a kind of quiet satisfaction in itself. The final chapter of his story was approaching, and it would be a gentle one compared to everything that had come before. Chapter 11. The Last Years and the Legacy. Thomas Paine spent his final years in America, living quietly. He was no longer at the center of revolution or political debate. He wrote occasionally, but his health was declining and his public influence was limited. The man who had once shaped the thinking of a continent was now living in relative obscurity. He died on June 8, 1809, in New York City. He was around 72 years old. His death did not bring the kind of national mourning that had followed great figures of the Revolution. He was buried on his farm in New Rochelle, and the gathering at his funeral was small. The country he had helped inspire did not in that moment stop to properly honor him. But look back at the whole journey, and what you see is extraordinary. A small boy in Thetford, a working man who tried many things and struggled at most of them. A man who crossed the ocean with little money and no fame. A writer who found his voice and used it to reach people who had never expected anyone in power to speak to them directly. A figure who was present at the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the debates about what society owed its ordinary members. The story of Thomas Paine is not a neat story of success. It is full of failure, difficulty, poverty, loneliness, and misunderstanding. He was not loved consistently. He was not always treated fairly. He made enemies as well as admirers. And he died without the recognition that history would eventually give him. But he never stopped. That is the through line in everything. Through failed jobs and financial struggles, through political controversy and prison, through the indifference and hostility of people who had once admired him, Paine continued to write. He continued to ask questions. He continued to believe that words could do something useful in the world. That belief is what his life demonstrates most clearly. Influence does not always begin with power. A person can start with very little, just a pen, an idea, a voice, and reach people far beyond their immediate circle. Paine showed that this was possible, not as an abstraction, but as a documented, verifiable fact of history. If you are reading this today, wherever you are in the world, and you feel like you are starting from a place that does not seem important or impressive, Paine's story is worth remembering. He had no famous name when he started. He had no wealth and no political connections. He had a mind and a commitment to using it honestly. That was enough to change things. Thomas Paine changed history not with an army, but with words. The man who began with very little left behind something that could not easily be measured. He left behind influence. He left behind ideas that outlasted him and reached further than he could have predicted. And that perhaps is the best measure of a life spent writing honestly about things that matter. His words still exist. Common sense is still read. The American crisis is still quoted. Rights of man is still discussed in classrooms and in conversations about political philosophy. The ideas he put into simple, direct language more than 2 centuries ago remain part of the way the world thinks about rights, government, and the relationship between ordinary people and power. That is a remarkable thing to leave behind, especially for a man who started with so little and struggled so consistently along the way. His words reached ordinary people. His writing gave people new ideas about freedom, courage, and independence. He showed that one person does not need great power to make a difference. His life was not always easy. He faced many problems, many difficult moments, and many changes. But he continued to write. He continued to share his ideas. And he continued to believe that words could help create a better future. That is one of the most inspiring lessons from the life of Thomas Paine. You do not need to be rich. You do not need to be famous. You do not need to have power. Sometimes you only need an idea, a little courage, and the strength to share your voice. Thank you for spending this time with me and learning about Thomas Paine, the man who had no army, but had the power of words. I hope this story helped you learn some new English and also gave you a little inspiration. If you enjoyed this lesson, please like the video and subscribe to English on This Day for more simple English stories about history, inspiring people, and important moments from the past. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next lesson.